this morning we continue this sermon series called Simple Words, these simple statements by Jesus that contain a whole lot of truth and challenging messages. And so today we find Jesus back on that beach with his disciples. This is post-resurrection, so this is resurrected Jesus. And it's the story that immediately follows the fishing story we looked at 2 weeks ago. The one where Jesus was on the shore and he said, "Haven't you any fish?" Put the net on this side, and they brought in all the catch. And so now we have this breakfast scene, this touching and powerful scene of restoration, forgiveness, love, and a challenge to follow, and what it means to follow and be a disciple. This interchange between Peter and Jesus. This over and over again, this, "Peter, do you love me? Peter, do you love me? Peter, do you love me?" And Peter getting a little bothered by this at the end. And so I want to just real quick look at this little exchange and then see maybe what's going on here. First, so he asked Peter, "Peter, do you love me more than these?" We don't know exactly what Jesus was referring to when he says these. We don't have a video, so we don't know what he was referencing. Was he referencing the other disciples? You know, these? Was he referencing the big fish that all the fish they just caught, the 153 fish? We don't know exactly what it is, but he's referring to something. "Peter, do you love me more than these? Do you love me more than your own life? Do you love me more than the nets that you dropped, 3 years ago when I asked you to fish for people, that you picked up again in your time of trying to figure out what was going on?" And so we have this challenge. "Peter, do you love me more than these?" And for the second time in his life, he's calling Peter to this new life of ministry. And he uses this term, "Do you love me?" And one of the interesting things about the English language compared to the Greek language and compared to a lot of languages is we often have one word for things that we have to sort of infer what we're referring to. So Valentine's Day was love. And if you say, "I love something," you have to be careful. When I say, "Man, I love this steak." Caleb made steaks last night. They were amazing. When I say, "I love this steak," it's not the same love that when I say, "I love you, Samantha," to my wife. If it was, then there's a problem. Right? So context, it's a good steak, but Samantha's way better. So we have to sort of infer it. And learning a language is difficult. And right now I'm trying to learn Spanish again. I've got my app. Ruth and I are, if you see Ruth and I discussing Spanish, it's because we're both working hard to try to learn it. I challenge you all to learn another language. If you have a smartphone, you get the Duolingo app and pick a language, there's like 100 of them, and go for it. My son's learning Japanese. I tried to do Arabic for like 3 seconds and then went back to Spanish. Much easier. But the English language is a difficult language. So in Greek, there's different words for love with different meanings. Now, scholars debate over this, and so we're just going to play around with this a little bit. I don't know if we might be looking too much into this, and it might be that Jesus just used different forms of the word love and that they were interchangeable in the first century. Or there was some intentionality behind this, but I think it's something fun to look at as we dive into this section. And so there's 3 forms of love in the Greek language. Do you know the big fancy one? Agape, right, the big fancy one. That's the one. Agape love is the unconditional love. That is, I will lay my life down for you. That's the love I hope you're expressing in a wedding ceremony. That's the love you have for your children. That's that deep, deep love. And then there's phileo love, which is friendship. Philadelphia is the city of what? Brotherly love. Why? Because it's Philadelphia, phileo. See, all the little language things. So that's camaraderie, friendship. That's the love between friends, pals, folks that hang out. Then there's eros love. We're in church, we can't talk a lot about this one. That's romantic, sort of passionate love, eros. So agape, eros, and phileo. The eros one is not used in this section at all. So we've got this sort of back and forth. Jesus begins by saying, "Peter, do you agape me?" So if you go to the Greek language, it says agape. Do you love me with everything that you have, with sacrificial love? Are you willing to give up everything for me? And interestingly enough, Peter replies with, yes, Lord, you know that I phileo you. Some translations even put it as, yes, Lord, you know that I am your friend. Interesting. Now, again, I'm going to just put a little asterisk here. We might be looking more into this than is really there. But I think it's fun to do and it's important to do. Yes, Lord, you know that I am your friend. And so he asks Peter again, Peter, do you agape me? And Peter says the second time, I phileo you. I am your friend. And then interestingly enough, the third time that Jesus asks him this, he says, Peter, do you phileo me? The third time. Do you even like me? Like a friend. Now, I added the even there. That's not really there. But there's this sort of sense that, will you give everything up for me? Well, you know I'm your friend. Will you give everything? I'm your friend. Okay, fine. Are you even my friend? Do you see the interchange there? And Jesus is ramping it up, and he's really trying to get to this point. Peter, are you committed to this? And Peter's reply, he says, Lord, because he's a little annoyed, a little bothered, why do you keep pressing? He says, Lord, you know that I love you. In other words, I believe that you are God and that you know all things, and so you know my heart, Jesus. You know that I love you. You know the pain that I felt watching you die on the cross. You know the pain that I felt when I denied you 3 times. The guilt that I have. Lord, you know this. You know this. So they have this interchange. And the question is, what is Jesus really talking about? Well, first, I'll give you a hint. It's not really about sheep. Jesus is not starting a sheep business. You know what, guys? We're going from fishing to sheep. We're going to expand. It's good to have different things. No. So this is after the great catch, right? The big catch of fish. That living parable teaching the disciples that they should be fishing. But now it's a little different. You've caught the fish, now you need to do something with them. You've caught the fish and you need to do something. In other words, those fish become sheep. The task of sharing the gospel becomes the task of discipleship. Evangelism leads to discipleship. We don't just become Christians and then stay that way, just in one spot. We go on to perfection. We're sanctified. We become more and more like Jesus as we go on in life. And unfortunately, Jesus compares us to sheep. And I don't mean blind, dumb sheep, but sheep that need a little guidance. Sheep need a shepherd, don't they? Sheep need a shepherd. You see, it's not just about sharing the gospel, it's about growing our faith. And it's a call for all to minister. It's not just the pastor's job to bring us more and more like Jesus. It's all of us to work to become more like Christ. So he's pushing him forward, pushing him further and farther. He's also he is. He mentions it at the end, right? You will eventually have your arm stretched out by somebody else. You'll be led somewhere. This image of possibly Peter's death, that he'll die a martyr's death. Are you willing to give it all up, Peter? To surrender who you are for this task? Do you love me more than these, Peter? Do you agape me more than these? For us, the challenge is very similar. I don't think God is calling us to go be martyred like Peter, but do you love me more than these? What are the these? That's the question, isn't it? What are the these in our life, in our church? The things that Jesus might say, Widlund United Methodist Church, do you love me more than these things? And in church life, there's all sorts of these. There's these things we've always done, the way we've always done it, the way we like to do it, the way we wish we did it. And Jesus is going, yeah, but what about the way I want you to do it? Which is even a question, because we have to figure that out. Because oftentimes we think the way Jesus wants it done is the way we like it done. Right? It must be God's way, because it feels good to me. So what are those things that we actively push in front of that relationship between us and Jesus? Those things that make the agape become more phileo. So that's the first challenge. And then Jesus isn't just pushing Peter to a new task. He's not just pushing Peter to a deeper connection or a deeper discipleship relationship. I think there's also a restoration here. Peter's just come off this difficult moment. Remember when, back in John 12, Jesus tells Peter, you're going to deny me 3 times. Before the rooster crows tomorrow morning, you're going to deny me. What did Peter say? I will never deny you. I'll never. Well, he does, first to a servant girl, then to a guard, and then to a servant of the high priest, and then what happens? The rooster crows, and Peter's faith is crushed. And while we know that Peter can be a little dense at times, I'm positive that he knew exactly what Jesus was pointing to. Maybe the 3 questions was connected to the 3 denials. Or maybe it was just 3. We don't know. But it's important. This isn't Jesus asking Peter, hey, are you really sorry about what you did? That's not what this is about. Or will you promise not to do this again? This isn't a chastising thing. This is a call for Peter into a deeper place in which Peter will be restored, in which grace will be given, and God will begin to do the work in Peter's life. I like what Pastor Brian McLaren says about this. He says, Jesus Christ asks each of us, not for obedience primarily, not primarily for repentance, not for vows, not for conduct, but for a heart. And that being given, all the rest will follow. Peter, give me your heart and we'll work all this stuff out. We'll work out the denial thing. We'll work out your struggle. Peter, we'll work out the fact that you always speak before you think. We'll work out the fact that you're sort of brash. We'll work out this stuff. We'll work out all of this. The guilt, the denial, the I'm going fishing because I'm fed up with waiting for Jesus. We'll work it all out. And of course, Peter gives him his whole heart. And in the process, Simon, son of John, once again becomes Peter the Rock. Peter the Rock, who in Acts 2, if you read Acts 2, and you hear the sermon that Peter preaches, you would think, this cannot be the same Peter. It can't be. He preaches this sermon that is bold, is powerful, is in your face. And what happens at that moment? 3,000 people become Christians that day in Jerusalem. That's a different Peter, isn't it? From no, I never knew him, to 3,000 people. God can change people. And then, of course, tradition tells us, we don't have this necessarily, we don't know this for sure, but tradition tells us that eventually Peter would be crucified upside down by the Emperor Nero because of his faith. And the story goes that he wanted to be crucified upside down because he wasn't worthy to be crucified like Jesus was. Bottom line is he was martyred for the faith. It's what Jesus does when he takes us, when we give him our whole heart, when we fully respond to his call, we are transformed. Peter becomes the leader of his church. He becomes the one that feeds and tends the sheep. He becomes a true follower. And I like that the last line of that section that was read today says, you remember the 2 words? Follow me. All of this, Peter, is about you following me in love and grace. And I want to wrap this up. I have a little connection here. I think as I think about this following of this interchange with Peter, there's a little bit of a connection to what we do on Communion Sundays. And I thought about, it's not Communion Sunday, why share this? But I think it's important. We don't get a lot of time on Communion Sunday to spend teaching about the table. So I just want to take a minute. See, there's no coincidence that just before these verses, Peter and others had eaten the fish and the bread. Right? Peter eats the fish and the bread, and then eventually they have this time around the fire after they've eaten. Robert Farrar, a theologian, says, grace cannot prevail until our lifelong certainty that someone is keeping score has run out of steam and collapsed. You see, this wasn't about scorekeeping with Jesus. And the communion we have, that time at the fire, wasn't Jesus keeping score. The do you love me, the feed my sheep, it was a way of Jesus reminding Peter that he's not keeping score, that he's not tallying. And we saw Jesus eat over and over again with the disciples. I encourage you sometimes, if you read through the Gospel of Luke, you'll see that all Jesus is doing with his disciples is eating. They go from one meal to the next. I promise you, there's actually a big old book written about it. But it's a meal to a meal to a meal to a meal with his disciples. There's something about the mealtime with Jesus. I think it's 10 different meals in the Gospel of Luke. See, eating with Jesus reminds us that faith isn't about being right or good or in agreement or having it all together. Faith is about feeding and being fed. We're fed by Christ and then we feed. We become followers and we continue that as we give to others. Of course, as Methodists, when we come to the table, it's an open table, right? Claim it's an open table. That you don't have to be saved, that you don't have to be right, that you can be Peter who just denied Jesus 3 times and you can still come. That even Judas was given communion. During Lent, I'm going to preach about Judas. And oh, if Judas would have just waited another day before he killed himself, he would have seen the resurrected Christ, and he'd have been restored in that same way. And I want to end with this quote. I don't know if you've read anything by Rachel Held Evans, but she says this: I don't know exactly how Jesus is present in the bread and the wine, but I believe Jesus is present. So it seems counterintuitive to tell people they have to wait and meet him someplace else before they meet him at the table. If people are hungry, I think about Peter, so hungry that day, let them come and eat. If people are thirsty, let them come and drink. And then she says this: it's not my table anyway. It's Christ's table. There's feeding. Jesus says, I feed you. Now would you feed my sheep? Would you drop your nets and fish? Would you be fed and would you feed? Would you follow me? Would you follow me? That's the call on that beach. That's the call at the table of Christ on the first Sunday of the month. If we were good Methodists, we would do that every Sunday. At least John Wesley would have us do that every Sunday. It's a call to follow. Would you pray? Lord Jesus, we thank you that on that beach and that at the table and in those moments with you, we aren't greeted with an angry God. Peter wasn't greeted with you chastising him. At that beach, you fed him and you restored him. He was so very hungry. He was so very thirsty. And you fed him and you restored him and you moved him along to look more and more like you. God, thank you for feeding and restoring us, for calling us to not just fish for people, but to feed your sheep, to become more like you, to agape you as you agape us. Lord, help us to follow. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. Would you stand for our closing hymn? The trees of the field. Worship God. This is one of those fun ones, so if you feel like you might want to move,